Your bloodline papers again. Lady Vivian's voice, sharp and cold as a winter frost, sliced through the morning air. Honestly, Elena, how many times must we endure this farce? I thought your little fantasy had been put to rest. I stood before her in a body I hadn't inhabited for 12 years, 23 and reborn. The sight of her was unchanged, from the venomous sneer twisting her lips to the perfectly manicured nail she tapped against my inheritance documents. The matter was never settled, Vivian. It was merely silenced. In my first life, which ended at the age of 35, I would have flinched. Today I met her gaze without blinking. The sweet scent of jasmine from my mother's garden drifted between us, a fragrance that should have brought comfort but now only fueled the metallic taste of fury on my tongue. Silenced? My dear girl, it was thoroughly discredited. The Royal College of Arms found your papers to be clumsy forgeries. Are you so desperate you're willing to be humiliated twice? The only thing I find humiliating is having to discuss my lineage with you, I retorted, a spark of my newfound confidence catching her off guard. In my past life, I was a mouse. Now, I knew where every trap in this house was laid. But since you seem so concerned with the purity of noble blood, perhaps we should be thorough. My fingers trembled, not with fear, but with the electric thrill of holding a winning hand. What are you babbling about? She snapped. Your blood is the only one in question. Is it? I allowed a small, knowing smile to form. The King's Herald arrives at sunset. He's been tasked with verifying all noble bloodlines before the coronation tomorrow. That gives us 18 hours. I tilted my head. He'll be examining my papers, of course, but I think I'll insist he gives yours that same thorough inspection. Let's make sure every seal is authentic, every signature dated correctly. Shall we? Vivian's face, for the first time, lost its mask of smug superiority. A flicker of genuine alarm crossed her features before she smothered it. You would not dare. My family's records are immaculate. We have served the crown for generations. So you always say, I murmured, my voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. But I've been thinking about history lately. It's a funny thing. So many stories get lost. Tell me, have you ever spent much time in the East Wing, down with the staff? They have such long memories there. I do not consort with servants, she said, her voice tight. Unlike you, I have standards to maintain. What does the East Wing have to do with anything? Oh, I think it has everything to do with everything, I replied, my smile widening as I remembered the stable boy's secret, a truth I had died without ever understanding its power. You see, while you were busy polishing your immaculate records, I was learning things about secrets kept in stables, about boys who look remarkably like girls they're not supposed to be related to. The color drained from her cheeks. You're insane. You're spouting nonsense to deflect from your own fraudulence. Am I? I took a step back, my purpose clear. The Herald will be the judge of that. I'm sure he'll be very interested in any new testimony, especially testimony that points to a bloodline far more tainted than mine. I turned my back on her, the feigned debate over. My real work was about to begin. Enjoy the sunshine, Vivian. I have a feeling the next 18 hours are going to be very long for you. Without another glance, I started walking toward the manor's east wing where Thomas waited, completely unaware that his life and hers was about to change forever. He thought himself a simple stable hand. He had no idea. His story was the key to my victory. I strode past Vivian without a word, my heels clicking a steady, defiant rhythm on the marble floors. The path to the guest wing, where visiting dignitaries like the King's Herald were quartered, was a gallery of her family's supposed glory. Portraits of stern-faced men and women, all bearing the same hawk-like nose and arrogant eyes as Vivian, stared down from gilded frames. In my first life, I had walked this hall with my head bowed, intimidated by the weight of their alleged history. Now, I saw them for what they were. Props. A collection of paid-for portraits of forgotten merchants and minor landowners, all posthumously enlisted to construct the grand fiction of House Thorne. Do you hear me, Elena? Stop this instant! Vivian's voice echoed behind me, laced with a fury that was rapidly curdling into panic. You cannot simply walk away from a direct accusation. I am not walking away from it, I called back over my shoulder, my pace unwavering. I am escalating it. There is a difference. The long corridor stretched before me, each step taking me further from the girl I was and closer to the woman I had to become. My first decisive action was not just a threat whispered in a garden. It was this march, this deliberate journey toward the seat of judgment. Escalating, what could you possibly do? She scoffed, her faster, shorter steps betraying her agitation as she struggled to keep pace. You have no allies, no influence. You are a gnat, buzzing before you are swatted. I stopped abruptly at the threshold of the guest wing, forcing her to halt to avoid colliding with me. I turned slowly, a cool smile on my lips. A gnat with a very sharp sting, it seems. You know, for someone so certain of her position, you seem awfully distressed. One might think you have something to hide. I let my eyes drift to the large oil painting beside us, a sour-faced woman dripping with jewels. Tell me, did your great-great-grandmother enjoy the Beaumont sapphires? I've read they went missing around the same time your family had its miraculous turn of fortune. Just a coincidence of history, I'm sure. Her face went pale. The Beaumont sapphires were a forgotten court scandal. A piece of gossip so old, no living person should have known the details. My knowledge of it was a weapon I'd just unsheathed. You are dredging up baseless rumors, slander, and desperation. That is all you have. We'll see, I said, turning my back on her again and proceeding down the hushed, carpeted hallway toward the Herald suite. The door was heavy oak, marked with a temporary silver plaque bearing the royal crest. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird beating its wings. But my hands were steady. In the darkest hour of the night, while the rest of the manor slept, I had sat at my desk and painstakingly drafted the document I now held. It was a formal petition, citing ancient but valid precedents for noble review, demanding a comparative analysis of my lineage against Vivian's own, on the grounds of suspected document fabrication intended to illegitimately disenfranchise a rival house. It was a legal masterpiece I could never have conceived 12 years ago. I reached the door. For a moment, I simply stood there, savoring the feeling of proactive power. I was no longer reacting to her moves. I was forcing her to react to mine. Then, with a smooth, deliberate motion, I knelt and slid the sealed letter under Harold Marcus's door. The crisp vellum whispered against the polished floor, a sound of fate being irrevocably altered. My formal request to investigate her lineage alongside mine was now in the hands of the one man who could not refuse it. "What are you doing?" Vivian's voice was a venomous hiss right behind me. A hand like a vice clamped around my wrist, her nails digging into my skin. She hauled me back to my feet, her face a mask of rage. "You think your peasant tricks will work twice? Do you have any idea the power my family wields?" I looked down at her hand on my arm, then back to her furious eyes, feeling no fear at all. "I think truth has a way of surfacing," I replied, my voice dangerously quiet. I pulled my arm free with a sharp tug that surprised her. "Especially when the right people start digging. You've built your entire life on a foundation of brittle lies, Vivian. All it takes is one person with a pickaxe to bring the whole thing crashing down. You insolent child, I will have you thrown out into the street." "You can't," I said with absolute certainty. "Not until the Herald has concluded his investigation, an investigation which now includes you." I gestured to the door. "You wanted to question my bloodline? Congratulations. The King's own Herald will now give both our claims the most scrupulous attention. I do hope your paperwork is as immaculate as you claim." "You will regret this," she seethed, her chest rising and falling rapidly. "When Marcus dismisses this trash, I will personally see to it that you never set foot in a noble house again." Click. The sound of the lock turning inside the Herald's room silenced her instantly. The heavy oak door opened a few inches, revealing a sliver of a man with a severe face, iron gray hair, and the weary eyes of someone who had seen every form of human vanity and deceit. Harold Marcus looked down, first at the sealed letter on the floor, then his gaze rose to my face, and finally to Vivian's sputtering, apoplectic one. His expression was utterly impartial, which was the most terrifying thing for Vivian to witness. He bent down, retrieved the letter, and broke the seal with a practiced thumb. His eyes scanned the contents in seconds, his brow furrowed in concentration. He did not speak, but the silence stretched into an eternity, thick with judgment. Finally, he looked up, his gaze once again moving between the two of us. A formal petition for comparative verification, citing the royal precedent of 482, he stated, his voice a low baritone that carried immense authority. He tucked the letter into his coat. The request is in order. His gaze settled on Vivian, who seemed to shrink under his scrutiny. And given the audible commotion in the hallway, I find the grounds for suspicion to be compelling. His final words echoed in the sudden tomb-like silence of the corridor, a death knell for Vivian's sense of untouchability. Both investigations begin at dawn. I expect full cooperation from all parties. The door closed with a soft, definitive thud. The game had been set. Vivian stood frozen, her mouth slightly agape, the furious color draining from her face to be replaced by the chalky white of dread. She had come to extinguish a spark, and I had forced her hand into a bonfire. I gave her one last look, a silent promise of the ruin to come, and walked away, leaving her alone in the hall with the ghosts of her fraudulent ancestors. My next move was already planned. She would run to the library to her gold and her influence. But I knew something she didn't. Herald Marcus couldn't be bought. Predictability was Vivian's greatest weakness, a flaw she mistook for consistency. I knew, with the certainty of a life already lived, that after the shock of our confrontation in the hall wore off, she would not retreat, she would counterattack. Her methods were always the same. Where direct intimidation failed, slander and bribery followed. And so, I followed her. I trailed her at a distance as she swept toward the grand library, her rage a palpable aura around her. I slipped through the heavy doors moments behind her, melting into the deep shadows of a reading alcove tucked away behind a thick tapestry depicting a stag hunt. My hiding spot was perfect, offering a clear view of the central fireplace, the heart of the room where I knew the meeting would take place. The library was Vivian's cathedral of lies. Thousands of leather-bound books, their spines uncreased and their pages uncut, filled shelves that reached the vaulted ceiling. They were props, just like the portraits. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and beeswax, and the only sound was the crackle and pop of logs in the cavernous fireplace, where the Thorne family crest, a hawk clutching a serpent, was carved into the marble mantel. I settled in to wait. It didn't take long. A servant announced Herald Marcus, who entered with the same stoic bearing he'd shown in the hall. He looked like a man of stone amidst Vivian's gilded cage. Vivian, having composed herself, adopted a posture of aggrieved dignity. She gestured for the herald to take a seat in one of the plush armchairs by the fire. Herald Marcus, thank you for agreeing to this private word. I felt it imperative to speak with you away from the hysterical theatrics of my cousin. Marcus remained standing. My lady, what I have to say on this matter will be said on the record. There is no need for privacy. But there is, she insisted, her voice dropping to a confidential, conspiratorial tone. There are delicate matters concerning Elena's state of mind. She has always been fragile, prone to fantasy. This sad obsession with her bloodline, it is a recurring delusion. Her father, my dear uncle, worried about it constantly before he passed. He feared her fantasies would one day bring shame upon us. She let out a soft, sorrowful sigh. It seems his fears have come to pass. I had to give her credit. It was a masterful performance. She was painting me as a pitiable, mad thing to be dismissed out of hand. But Herald Marcus's expression remained unchanged, his eyes giving away nothing. Sensing that her appeal to pity was failing, Vivian shifted to her second, cruder strategy. From the folds of her gown, she produced a heavy purse of deep crimson velvet, tied with a golden cord. The soft clink of coins was obscenely loud in the quiet room. She placed it on the small table between them, her shadow thrown large and distorted against the ancient tapestries by the firelight, making her look like some grasping creature of the dark. Lady Elena's claims are baseless fabrications, she whispered, pushing the purse slightly toward him. A flight of fancy from a troubled mind. I am certain a man of your experience can see that. A quick validation of my family's unimpeachable documents is all that is required. For your expediency, a gift. To thank you for your judicious handling of this delicate internal family matter. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. Marcus stared at the purse of gold, his face a granite mask. For a terrifying second, a flicker of my old life's fear returned. What if this time was different? What if this Herald, unlike the one I remembered, could be bought? Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he extended his hand. He did not take the purse. He pushed it back across the table, the velvet skidding to a halt just inches from her hand. The rejection was quiet, yet it felt as final and as loud as a slamming door. "My lady," he said, and his voice was colder than the stone of the fireplace. "I investigate all bloodlines with equal scrutiny. The law does not bend for gifts, nor does it falter for powerful names. You summoned me here to discuss your documentation. So, let us discuss it." From an inside pocket of his coat, he produced a file. He drew out a sheet of parchment, one of her documents. "I confess, in my preliminary review of your family archive, I noticed something. Your own documentation seems unusually pristine for papers supposedly centuries old." Vivian snatched the document from his hand, her composure shattering like fine glass. "These documents are authentic. They have been preserved with the utmost care, as befits a family that has served the crown for generations. You see an heirloom, I see a legacy. I see parchment that does not feel 300 years old," Marcus countered calmly, his gaze unwavering. "I see ink that has not had time to properly oxidize. The records in the Royal College are brittle, faded. This," he tapped the paper she held, "feels supple. The ink is a shade too black, too uniform. It is a testament to my ancestors' meticulous care," she insisted, her voice rising in pitch. "They understood the importance of history." "A history I am now charged with verifying," Marcus replied smoothly. He was like a surgeon, his words precise cuts, excising her lies one by one. "Then you won't mind if I examine the parchment age and ink composition?" "A simple test. A royal alchemist can determine the precise origin of the materials. It will either confirm your claims of meticulous preservation or reveal something else entirely. It is a standard procedure, my lady, one that will allow me to dismiss my concerns and Elena's petition entirely, assuming, of course, that everything is in order." "This is preposterous," she finally exploded, all pretense of civility gone. She was on her feet, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "This is an insult of the highest order. You are a glorified clerk, a man of no significant birth. You dare question my noble heritage on the word of a hysterical girl and your own baseless suspicions?" "I dare to do my duty as sworn by my oath to the king," Marcus said, his voice remaining level, which only infuriated her more. "Your heritage is not being questioned, Lady Vivian. The authenticity of your proof is. There is a difference." The crackling fire seemed to die down, the warm amber light shrinking away to leave cold, grasping shadows to fill the room. The confrontation was over. Vivian stood trembling, speechless with a rage that had no target left to strike. Harold Marcus paid her no further mind. He moved to the great library desk, pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and his own quill, and began to write. The sharp, decisive scratching of his nib on the page was the only sound. It was the sound of her world beginning to unravel. From my hiding place, I felt a cold, sharp thrill of victory. She had taken the bait. She had revealed her hand. And now, the Crown's most incorruptible investigator had his sights set directly on her. The first trap had been sprung perfectly. Dawn broke cold and gray, the weak sunlight struggling to pierce the oppressive gloom that had settled over the manor. The 18-hour clock had bled away its night, and with the morning came the certainty of a reckoning. I had not slept. Instead, I had sat by my window watching the stars fade, my mind a whirlwind of strategy and memory. Just as the first servants began to stir, a soft but insistent knock came at my door. A junior clerk in the Herald's livery stood there, his face impassive. "Lady Elena, Herald Marcus requests your presence in the library at your earliest convenience." He has an update on the preliminary investigation. The words were a calm, procedural summons, but they sent a jolt of triumph through me. It was happening. It was happening faster than I could have dreamed. When I entered the library, the scene was vastly different from the one I had spied upon hours earlier. The fire had been rekindled, casting a clean, businesslike light across the room. Harold Marcus stood not by the grand fireplace but at the massive central table. It was covered with documents, Vivian's pristine, fraudulent papers laid out beside my own worn but genuine articles. He had set up a small workstation with lenses, calipers, and small vials of chemicals. He looked up as I entered, his eyes holding a flicker of something new. Not suspicion, but a kind of professional fascination. "Lady Elena, thank you for coming so promptly," he began, his voice devoid of any warmth but ringing with purpose. "I have been working through the night on the initial verification of the documents provided by you and your cousin, Lady Vivian. I have discovered a significant discrepancy." "A discrepancy?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral, playing the part of the concerned petitioner. "That is a mild term for it," he corrected, a dry note entering his tone. He gestured for me to approach the table. As I suspected, the parchment and ink composition of Lady Vivian's ancestral charter raised immediate flags. The materials felt far too new. So, I conducted an elemental analysis on the pigments used in the family crest, right here. He pointed to the top of the charter where the Thorn family's hawk clutched its serpent, painted in bold colors. Specifically, the vibrant blue used for the hawk's eye and the serpent's scales. He slid a powerful magnifying lens over the spot. "Please, look." I bent over, my heart hammering. Under the lens, the blue was brilliant, almost electric. "That particular shade," Marcus explained, his voice close by, "is known as cobalt blue. It is a beautiful, stable pigment. It is also, by the king's own alchemical records, an invention of the last half-century. It was first synthesized by the Alchemists' Guild no more than 50 years ago." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the quiet room. "This document, which purports to be a royal grant from the reign of King Theron IV, is dated 360 years ago. You see the impossibility. It was more perfect than I could have imagined. In my first life, Vivian's fraud was never uncovered. She had wielded her power so effectively that no one ever dared to look this closely. But I had forced the issue, and the truth once sought was laughably simple. So the charter, the crest, is a forgery," Marcus stated, his voice flat and final. "An exceptionally crafted one, I might add. The penmanship is a masterful imitation of the period script. The seal was likely impressed from the original, somehow. But the artist who illuminated the crest made a fatal error. He used the best materials available to him in his time, not the materials of the time he was trying to imitate." He straightened up, his expression grim. "Her entire noble lineage, as proven by this charter, is fabricated. It is the most audacious case of ancestral fraud I have ever had the misfortune to investigate. By tomorrow's coronation, Lady Vivian, the woman who had built her identity on the bedrock of her pure, ancient bloodline, would be exposed as a fraud. The whispers and accusations she had leveled at me would boomerang back to shatter her. I would not only be cleared, but I would be vindicated in the most public and humiliating way imaginable for my rival. My name would be restored, my lands would be secure. I would claim my rightful place among the true nobility, not as a suspect claimant, but as the woman who exposed the greatest lineage hoax of the generation." A dizzying sense of victory washed over me, so potent it almost brought me to my knees. The future I had lost, the honor my mother had cherished, was within my grasp. Harold Marcus was already gathering his tools. "I will need to draft my official report for the king. There will be a formal hearing this evening before the coronation preparations begin in earnest. You will be called to testify, Lady Elena, as will Lady Vivian." His gaze met mine, and for the first time, I saw a glint of something that might have been sympathy. "Be prepared. The truth can be a brutal weapon in a court of whispers." I thanked him and left the library, my mind racing. The plan had worked. Victory was assured. I could simply wait for the hearing, watch as Marcus presented his irrefutable evidence, and savor Vivian's downfall. It would be enough. It would restore my honor. But as I walked through the grand, silent halls of the manor, a new thought, cold and sharp as a shard of ice, cut through my elation. Exposing Vivian was only half the battle. It was defense. It was taking back what was stolen. It wasn't true power. True power was not about restoring the old order. It was about building a new one. Vivian's fall would leave a vacuum, and nature, especially the nature of noble courts, abhorred a vacuum. Some other grasping, ambitious family would simply take her place. The game would continue just with new players. No, I couldn't wait for her next move, or for the court to decide her fate. I had to be more audacious than she ever was. I had to shatter the entire game board. My victory wouldn't be complete until the power she had stolen and abused was placed in hands worthy of it. My path forward was no longer aimed at the library or the courtroom, but at the stables. I picked up my pace, my purpose renewed and sharpened to a razor's edge. I headed straight to the East Wing, where Thomas held the proof that would not just expose her as a fraud, but shatter her world completely. The stables smelled of hay, horse, and honest labor, a world away from the cloying perfumes and polished lies of the manor. I found Thomas in a dusty shaft of sunlight, brushing down my mare, his movements gentle and sure. He worked with a quiet focus, a calm that seemed to emanate from him and soothe the animals around him. He was of average height, with a strong build from his work, and plain, kind features that were now smudged with dirt. He looked up as I approached, his brow furrowing in surprise. It was rare for any of the nobles to set foot in the stables, least of all a lady. "My lady," he said, giving a short, respectful bow. "Is something amiss with Nutmeg?" "Nutmeg is fine, Thomas. She looks happier than I've ever seen her," I said, reaching out to stroke the mare's nose. "It's you I came to see." He looked genuinely baffled. "Me, my lady? I need to ask you some questions about your past. I know they might seem strange, but please, just answer them honestly. It is of the utmost importance." He leaned his shoulder against the horse, his posture wary. "I don't have much of a past, my lady. Grew up in the church orphanage in the South Valley. Been working here since I was a boy. That's all there is." "The orphanage," I said, seizing on the detail. "Did they give you anything when you left? A memento of who you were before you arrived?" His hand went instinctively to his neck, where a simple leather cord was tucked beneath his tunic. It was a gesture I had seen 1,000 times in my past life, but never understood. He hesitated. "Why are you asking this?" "Because I believe you are more than you think you are, Thomas," I said, my voice soft. "I believe your past is the key to the future of this entire estate. Please, let me see what you have there." Suspicion warred with curiosity in his eyes. He had no reason to trust me, a noble lady who had never given him more than a passing glance before. I had to give him one. "You once found my mother's silver locket by the garden path. You could have sold it for a month's wages, but you returned it to her directly. You told her you didn't believe in taking what wasn't yours. Do you remember?" He stared at me, his mouth slightly agape. I remember, but that was years ago. How do you—" "My mother never forgot it, and neither did I. You are a good and honest man, Thomas. That is why I'm here. Now, please." Slowly, reluctantly, he pulled the leather cord over his head. Attached to it was a small oilskin pouch, worn smooth with time. He handed it to me. My fingers trembled as I took it. Inside was a single folded document. The parchment yellowed and the ink faded, but still legible. And nestled in the fold was a tiny carved wooden bird, no bigger than my thumb. I unfolded the paper. It was a birth certificate, officially sealed by the Royal Chancellery. It recorded the birth of twins to Lord and Lady Thorne, a daughter, Vivian, and a son, Thomas. I looked up at him, his face a mask of confusion. "What is it?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "It's the truth," I said, my own voice thick with emotion. I turned the document so he could see it, pointing to the names. "This is your birth certificate. It says you were born to the late Lord and Lady Thorne, on the very same day as Lady Vivian." I watched his face as the meaning of the words sank in. I saw denial, then shock, then a wave of pure, uncomprehending pain. "No," he whispered, shaking his head and taking a step back. No, that's not possible. It's a mistake. It's some kind of cruel joke. It's not a joke, I said firmly, holding his gaze. She is your twin sister, Thomas. You are the true-born son of this house. This document is the proof. But why? The question was a raw wound. If this is true, why was I thrown away? Why was I raised in an orphanage while she was raised as a lady? Because a son would have inherited everything, I explained, the ugly truth falling into the quiet space between us. The title, the lands, the wealth. A daughter would have been married off with a dowry. Someone, likely your father, decided one heir was better than two. He chose her and discarded you. He slumped back against the stable wall, his face ashen. The foundation of his entire life had just been pulverized. He was not a nameless orphan. He was a dispossessed lord. The revelation was not a gift, but a burden of grief and anger. So what now? He finally asked, his voice hollow. What do you want from me? Justice, I said, my voice ringing with conviction. Vivian has proven herself unfit to rule. She is cruel, arrogant, and a fraud. Her power is illegitimate in more ways than one. This estate, this name, this legacy, they are yours by birthright. I want you to claim what is yours. He looked from the damning certificate in my hand to his own, calloused and dirt-stained. Me! I'm a stable boy. I don't know how to be a lord. I can't— You already are one, I interrupted, stepping closer. Forget the title. You have the character she has always lacked. You are honest. You are kind. You are diligent. This house doesn't need another arrogant tyrant. It needs a steady hand. It needs a good man. It needs you. I pushed the certificate back into his hand. Herald Marcus is exposing her forged lineage this evening. The timing is perfect. While she is reeling from that accusation, we will present him with this, the true claim. Not as a stable boy, but as Lord Thomas Thorne. He stared at the paper, then at the tiny wooden bird in his palm, and finally, at me. The dazed, haunted look in his eyes began to recede, replaced by a flicker of something new, a spark of anger, a hint of resolve. The docile, stable hand was fading, and a lord forged in injustice and tempered by humility was beginning to emerge. She questioned your bloodline, he said, his voice quiet but firm. And all the while, mine was the one that mattered. He closed his hand into a fist, crushing the document and the wooden bird within it. All right, tell me what I have to do. The journey from the stables to the manor's quiet west wing felt like crossing a national border. I led Thomas through corridors he had only ever known as a servant, his footsteps hesitant on the plush carpets. He walked with his head slightly bowed, a habit ingrained by a lifetime of servitude. For my plan to work, that had to change before we faced Herald Marcus. I guided him into a small, disused sitting room that had belonged to my father, a place of comfortable leather chairs and quiet dignity, untouched by Vivian's gaudy renovations. It was a pocket of the past, a fitting place to forge the future. We need to get you cleaned up, I said gently, gesturing to a wash basin. And you cannot meet the herald dressed in stable clothes. While he washed the grime of his labor from his hands and face, I went to my father's wardrobe. The clothes were old-fashioned but well made from simple dark wool. They would fit his broad frame well enough. There was no finery, no silk or embroidery. Just the respectable attire of a country nobleman. It was perfect. He took the clothes hesitantly, his calloused fingers brushing against the fine weave as if it might burn him. My lady, I don't know if I can do this, he confessed, his voice low and strained. To stand before a king's herald and claim to be a lord? They will laugh at me. They will not laugh, I said, my tone firm but reassuring. I took the small oilskin pouch from him and laid its contents on a polished table, the birth certificate and the tiny wooden bird. They will look at this. I picked up the bird, turning it over in the light. It was crudely carved, the work of a child, but the detail was unmistakable. On its underside, so small it was almost invisible, was a single letter, T. Do you see this? I asked, showing it to him. It matches the T in the Thorne family crest, the same one carved into the library fireplace. He stared at it, his eyes wide. I made that, he whispered. I remember whittling it when I was very young, before the orphanage. I kept it because it was the only thing I had that was mine. It is more than that, Thomas. It is a piece of your identity, a link to your past that you carved with your own hands. You are not claiming to be a lord. You are simply claiming to be yourself. I looked him in the eye, willing him to see the strength I saw in him. When we go in there, you do not need to be eloquent. You do not need to know the law. You just need to be honest. Let me handle the rest. Can you do that? He looked at the clothes, at the certificate, at the tiny bird in his palm. He took a deep breath, and when he let it out, some of the fear seemed to go with it. I can be honest, he said, his voice steadier now. It's the one thing I've always been. He began to change into my father's clothes. The transformation was immediate and startling. The simple, well-cut garments hung on his frame, not as a costume, but as a natural fit. They gave him a quiet authority that his servant's tunic had concealed. The stable boy was gone. A stranger stood in his place, a man who looked like he belonged. I sent a request for a second, urgent meeting, and Marcus agreed to see us at once in the library. As we entered, the Herald was standing by the window, staring out at the setting sun. The light was turning golden, casting the room in long, dramatic shadows. He turned, his expression unreadable as he saw me, and then his eyes fell on Thomas, standing tall and straight-backed at my side. A flicker of surprise crossed his face. "Lady Elena," he said, his voice cautious, "you said you had new information regarding the Thorn lineage. I must admit, I did not expect you to bring a witness." "This is not a witness, Herald Marcus," I said, my voice clear and steady in the quiet room. "Your investigation has uncovered a forgery, but you have only uncovered half the truth. The other half stands before you." I walked forward and placed the worn birth certificate on the table between us. "This is Lord Thomas Thorn." Herald Marcus looked from the document to Thomas's face, then back again. He picked up the certificate, his movements slow and deliberate. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the fire. He held the parchment up to the fading light, his expert eye scanning every letter, every flourish of the scribe's pen. He paid special attention to the royal seal at the bottom, its wax darkened with age. "The seal of the royal chancellery is authentic," he murmured almost to himself. "And this handwriting, this is the work of Scribe Alastair. I'd know his hand anywhere. He was meticulous, incorruptible." He lowered the document, his sharp gaze falling on me. "You brought this to me, Lady Elena. Thomas has been a stable hand on this estate for 20 years. How long have you known about this?" The question was a test. He was probing the mystery of my knowledge, the source of my sudden disruptive power. "I have known long enough to see a great injustice," I replied carefully, meeting his gaze without flinching. "And I chose to reveal it now for one reason." "And what reason is that?" "Because she questioned my bloodline once too often," I said, the words sharp and true. "Her crime was not just against me, Herald. It was against him. She built her entire life on his erasure, on the lie that he never existed. Questioning my heritage was simply the final arrogance that gave me the strength to seek the whole truth. Thomas has the stronger claim, not just to her stolen titles, but to the very name she bears." Marcus placed the certificate back on the table, his expression one of profound gravity. He looked at Thomas, who stood silent and resolute, a man waiting for a verdict that was 2 decades overdue. "This changes everything," the Herald said, his voice low but carrying the weight of law and history. "Everything. The laws of primogeniture are absolute. If this document is verified, and I have little doubt it will be, then Thomas is the sole heir of the late Lord Thorn. By birthright law, he inherits the estate, the titles, and all associated holdings. Entirely." He let the words sink in, spelling out the consequences with brutal clarity. Lady Vivian would not simply be stripped of her title. She would be left with nothing. No land, no wealth, no name. Legally, the life she has known has belonged to him since the day he was born. The sun dipped toward the horizon, its last rays spearing through the tall library windows and igniting the dust motes in the air. The long shadows stretched across the courtyard outside, and the world seemed to hold its breath. All eyes in the room, mine, the Herald's, were on Thomas. He was no longer just a man, he was a fulcrum upon which a great house was about to turn. Harold Marcus took a step toward him, his voice softer now, yet more direct. "Do you understand what this means, son? The burden that will fall to you?" Thomas looked at the Herald, a man who represented the system that had allowed his life to be stolen, and yet was now his only path to justice. His voice, when he spoke, was not the hesitant murmur of a stable hand, but the clear, firm tone of a man who had found his footing on solid ground. "I understand that my life has been a lie," he said, "and I am ready to make it true." He was no longer a servant in disguise, no longer a pawn in my game. He stood tall, my father's simple clothes, lending him a gravitas that Vivian's silks and jewels could never possess. In the fading light, he looked every inch the lord he was born to be. The great coronation hall was a dazzling sea of silk, velvet, and jewels. Light from 100 chandeliers fractured through the stained glass windows, painting the air in vibrant, shifting colors. The collective murmur of the kingdom's most powerful families filled the vaulted space, a hum of anticipation and ambition. From my place among the lesser nobility, I had a perfect view of Lady Vivian. She was seated in a position of high honor near the throne, resplendent in a gown of shimmering gold, a smug, triumphant smile playing on her lips. The Herald's investigation into her lineage had been conducted with quiet discretion, and she had clearly misinterpreted the silence as a victory. She believed she had won. She believed I was a forgotten footnote, a minor annoyance now swept aside. Her arrogance was a brilliant, blinding light, and it was about to become the very thing that incinerated her. I felt the weight of Thomas's worn birth certificate, tucked safely in my bodice. My own victory was not silent. It was about to be very, very loud. The ceremony began, fanfare sounded, and the procession of the royal heir commenced. The air grew thick with incense and reverence. It was in the sacred pause just before the final oaths were to be sworn that Harold Marcus acted. He rose from his designated place, a stark figure of iron-gray sobriety amidst the glittering assembly. The breach of protocol was so profound that a shocked silence fell over the entire hall. Every eye turned to him, and then a collective gasp rippled through the crowd as they saw the man who rose with him. It was Thomas. Dressed in the simple but dignified dark wool of my father, he was an island of quiet substance in an ocean of flash. Pinned to his chest, stark against the dark fabric, was the Thorn family crest, the silver hawk clutching the serpent. He wore the crest Vivian had claimed as her own for a lifetime. Harold Marcus did not wait for permission to speak. His voice, trained to fill such halls, rang out with indisputable authority. "Your Majesty, I beg a moment's pause. My duties as King's Herald compel me to speak on a matter of succession and fraud that has immediate bearing on these proceedings and the integrity of this noble court." He turned his gaze, cold and sharp as a blade, directly to the woman in gold. Lady Vivian Thorn. He used her full, supposed title, and the name hung in the air like a death sentence. "I ask you before this esteemed assembly to explain a simple matter. Explain how your brother came to work in your stables while you enjoyed his inheritance." The shock in the room was absolute. Vivian shot to her feet, her face a mask of disbelief and fury. "Brother? What is this madness? Herald, you are overstepping your station. I have no brother." Her eyes found Thomas, and a look of pure, venomous hatred contorted her features. She pointed a trembling finger at him. "This is Elena's desperate conspiracy. That is a stable hand she has dressed in fine clothes to sow chaos. Seize them both." But no guards moved. All eyes were on the Herald, who held up a hand to quell the rising din. "It is no conspiracy, my lady," Marcus said, his voice cutting through her tirade. "The official birth records, signed and sealed by the Royal Chancellery, tell a different story. They show twin children born to your parents on the 3rd day of the harvest moon, 35 years ago." He unrolled a document with a dramatic flourish, the authentic birth certificate. A daughter, Vivian, and a son, Thomas. Only one, it seems, was raised in luxury. "Those records are forged!" she shrieked, her voice cracking, her carefully constructed composure disintegrating before hundreds of watching eyes. Lies! All lies. I am the sole heir. I have always been the sole heir. My family's lineage is a matter of historical record. Indeed it is, Marcus agreed, a dangerous edge to his voice. And we have examined that record. We found your ancestral charter, the very foundation of your claim, was illuminated with pigments that were not invented until 50 years ago. A masterful forgery, but a forgery nonetheless. A fresh wave of murmurs and gasps swept the hall. The foundation of her identity was cracking. You claim these birth records are forged, Marcus continued, his voice relentless. But a forgery is a copy of something real. The real record of your birth lies with the Chancellery, and it names you both. It's a lie, a trick, she insisted, looking wildly around for support, her eyes pleading with the other nobles who had been her friends just moments before. They looked away, their faces hardening. No one would meet her gaze. She was radioactive. Then perhaps you can explain this, Marcus said, playing his final devastating card. He held up the small, crude wooden bird Thomas had carved as a child. This token was found with your brother when he was left at the South Valley Orphanage, a childhood keepsake. He then produced another object, the master seal that had been used to impress the wax on Vivian's fraudulent documents. It was not ancient metal, but a wood carving, aged and stained to look older than it was. Our royal artisans have confirmed the wood of this ancient family seal is from the same branch of ironwood as this little bird. It seems 2 toys were carved that day, one for the son, one for the daughter. The daughter's, it seems, was later repurposed for a grander ambition. He turned to Vivian, his voice dropping, but every person in the silent hall heard his final damning question. Can you explain why the grain of this seal, the very instrument of your family's legitimacy, bears the faint, preserved fingerprints of the child, Thomas? Checkmate. There was no answer. No escape. The lie was not just exposed, it was vivisected for the entire world to see. Vivian stood frozen, her face a canvas of utter ruin, the golden gown now looking like a gaudy costume on a fallen actress. The king, who had watched the entire exchange with a stony expression, made a subtle gesture with his hand. The ornate coronet of the Thorn House, resting on a velvet pillow and waiting to be formally presented to Vivian as part of the ceremony, was now in motion. A royal guard lifted the pillow and, with solemn purpose, walked away from a trembling, hyperventilating Vivian. He walked directly to Thomas, who watched his approach with a steady, somber gaze. The guard knelt and offered the coronet. In a gesture of immense symbolic power, Thomas did not grab for it. He reached out and gently touched the silver hawk, the crest that was his by right, and then gave a slow, deliberate nod. His hand was perfectly steady. The entire court gasped in a single, unified shock as the inheritance of a great house changed hands before their very eyes. The question of my bloodline, the initial spark that had ignited this inferno, had dissolved into complete irrelevance. But in its place, a new, more unsettling mystery emerged, and I could feel it in the hundreds of eyes that were now fixed on me. The whispers changed. They were no longer about Vivian's fraud, but about my role in its unveiling. How could I have known? How could a disgraced minor noblewoman orchestrate such a perfect, devastating coup? How did I know about the stable boy, the forgeries, the secrets buried for decades? I locked eyes with the dethroned Vivian across the hall. In her gaze, I saw not just hatred, but a sliver of dawning, horrified understanding. She was not looking at a rival. She was looking at a ghost. The fallout was immediate and absolute. As the coronation ceremony hastily concluded, Vivian was no longer Lady Thorne. She was simply Vivian, a woman with no title, no lands, and no allies. I watched as guards, with the kind of embarrassed pity, escorted her from the Great Hall, not through the grand central doors, but through a small, ignominious side exit used by servants. They were taking her to a carriage that would transport her to a remote convent, the royal family's preferred method for erasing inconvenient people. I made sure our paths crossed in the quiet, shadowed antechamber. She was stripped of her golden gown and jewels, dressed now in plain, gray wool. The only thing she retained was the burning hatred in her eyes when she saw me. "You," she hissed, her voice a ragged tear in the silence. "You did this. This was never about your bloodline. This was monstrous. What are you? I leaned in close, my voice a whisper only she could hear, savoring this final, perfect moment of reversal. Here, in the shadows, she was the powerless one, and I held all the cards. Some secrets, Vivian, I whispered, are worth dying for and living for. You taught me that. You just never imagined the secrets wouldn't be yours. I smiled, a true, final smile of victory, and stepped back, letting the guards lead her away to her new life of prayer and obscurity. She was a ghost now, and I was the one who had learned to haunt. 3 months later, the scent of jasmine from my mother's garden once again filled the air, but now it was a fragrance of peace. The manor, now rightfully Lord Thomas Thorne's, had transformed. The oppressive gloom was gone, replaced by a sense of quiet purpose. I found Thomas in the library, though it, too, was a different place. The dusty, unread books had been cataloged, and some were even open on the great table, where he was reviewing petitions from tenant farmers. He looked up as I entered, a frown of concentration on his face. "Elena, thank goodness," he said, relief washing over his features. "The farmers from the South Meadow are in a dispute with the West Ridge tenants over water rights for the coming season. The law is ambiguous. The South Meadow lands have seniority, but the West Ridge provides more grain for the tithe. What do I do?" I came and stood beside him, looking down at the map of the estate. I remembered this season from my past life. It was a season the royal almanacs had predicted would be dry, causing widespread panic and hoarding. They had been wrong. "Tell the West Ridge farmers they will have all the water they need," I said without hesitation. "And give the South Meadow tenants a portion of our own stores to see them through. Open the sluice gates fully." Thomas looked at me, his brow furrowed. "But the almanac predicts a dry season. If we do that and the rains fail, we could lose half the harvest." "The almanac is wrong," I said with unshakable certainty. "The rains will come within the fortnight, and they will be plentiful. Your generosity now will be rewarded with a loyalty that will last for generations." He studied my face, searching for the source of my impossible confidence. This was a familiar dance for us now. In the past months, I had guided him through a dozen such political and economic minefields, my advice always proving uncannily, miraculously correct. The whispers at court were no longer about my bloodline. They were about my almost supernatural ability to predict court politics, market shifts, and even the weather. I had become the most enigmatic and feared advisor in the kingdom. He sighed, shaking his head in fond disbelief. "All right, Elena, I will trust you. I have learned it is always the wisest course of action." He signed the order. Then he grew serious, his gaze direct and searching. "But I must ask you again, how do you know? Not just about the rains and the court intrigues, but about me. You knew my name. You knew about the wooden bird I carved as a child. You saw a truth about me that I never saw myself. Please, tell me how." I simply smiled, a gentle, mysterious expression that I knew both frustrated and fascinated him. My hand went to my throat, my fingers closing around the object that rested there, hidden beneath the high collar of my dress. It had appeared there the moment I awoke in my 23-year-old body, a smooth, cool teardrop of some unknown dark stone, set in silver that never tarnished. It was a secret I kept even from him. As I touched it, I felt a faint, pleasant warmth spread through the stone, a familiar sensation, the quiet thrum of approval it gave off whenever fate bent to my will, whenever a piece of my design clicked perfectly into place. Time, it seems, has made me its favorite player. I am no longer a piece on the board, moved by the whims of others. I am the hand that sets the pieces, the mind that sees the entire game, from the opening move to the final inevitable checkmate. And I was only just beginning to play.